that time of the show where we take a look at our G20 Focus. And the host, Thulasizwe Simelane, is going to be joining us virtually. Perhaps to tell us a little bit more about what we have in store for us tonight. Thulas, good afternoon. So we're edging closer to your show, of course, happening a little later on. And all eyes on the biggest economies of the world, looking at what they're going to be prioritizing: climate finance, conflict resolution, global shifting dynamics, trade wars as well. You're certainly covering a lot in the build-up to this ultimate G20 summit. But for tonight, what's the focus?
Sure, Liesl, good afternoon. It's great to talk to you and connect with you in this way. So we are 54 days and about 10 hours away from the G20 Leaders Summit to be held in Johannesburg. And when we talk G20, and it's always important to go back to the numbers, just what G20 represents, right? About 85% of the world's gross domestic product, as well as about 75% of world trade. The world trade part of it is what we'll be covering this evening, that element, because if you think about it, the diversity of G20 countries covering both industrialized and developing nations as well, that forum that it is for interface between those developing nations in transition, as well as developed nations. So trade becomes really important when you think about 75% of global trade being within the 19 countries that make up the G20, as well as then the two country blocks being the European Union as well as the African Union. But here's the reality though, Liesl, and this is where our conversation will take us this morning, later on this evening. One of the things we expect will happen before we get to the Leaders Summit, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, releases its trade monitoring report almost every year. They've had 31 editions. And last year, the Director General of the WTO, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, when releasing this report last year, she was concerned about what they call trade restrictive measures that were introduced even among G20 countries themselves, right? And they were talking about those covering new ones, new trade restrictive measures, covering, get this, about 828 billion US dollars in trade with new measures that were introduced last year to take up the levels of trade that now have some kind of restrictive measure applicable to about $2 trillion. She was concerned then. That was around October last year. You can only imagine how much concern she has coming up to the G20 this year in 2025, with all the other measures that have now come into place, such as the tariffs that we have seen earlier on this year. So that's what we are focusing on this evening. What does fair trade look like? What are the rules? Because you and I see ships crisscrossing the oceans. We see planes carrying all sorts of goods that are being traded, but there are rules that underpin all of that. And it's always been the intention that those rules are meant to be fair and encouraging economic growth in various regions of the world. So we are focusing on that. Fair trade, what are the rules, and what would it look like when we truly push towards fairer trade? And my guests will be Daniel McKay, who is the CEO of global trade consultancy company XA Global Trade Advisors. We'll also be joined by Lerato Matabuche, who is the African Union Commissioner for Infrastructure and Energy, as well as Nogwanda Masego, a senior economist at the think tank Trade and Industry Policy Strategies.
Oh, Thulas, there's so much coming through there because there's been big talks about reforms when it comes to the World Trade Organization at large and the divisions, whether that's ultimately also going to be stalling processes once again, protectionism, barriers to entry, particularly for the African market. There's a lot to handle. Looking forward to that. Perhaps you can just remind us of the time and perhaps how we can also tune in as we wrap up our conversation. Looking forward to it.
Spot on. There is a lot to cover. The principles are out there, and all of them overall, they are meant to encourage fairer trade and the principles of consistency that you are supposed to treat all countries equally when you are trading with them. But in reality, we see something different playing itself out. And what is the role, for example, of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area? We're also coming up around the conversation around AGOA. Africa Growth and Opportunities Act, which also facilitated entry into the US market for a number of African countries and their products. But all of that, we will put it under the spotlight. We are on air on SABC News, the SABC News channel, SABC2, as well as SABC Plus, and we are on air from 8:30 p.m. Until 9:30 p.m. this evening.